So welcome everybody. My name is Laura Horwood-Benton. I am the Public Programming and Community Relations Librarian at Portsmouth Public Library in New Hampshire. So this event will hopefully go no later than 5:30 p.m. and we do respect your time. And today we're going to be muting everyone's audio and video. So if you have questions for our speaker, Joseph Nye, please feel free to ask them in the chat. We will be monitoring those. And as I said, the program will be recorded today, and we will be putting it up on the library's YouTube page during the week next week. So you'll get that email with a link to the YouTube recording. So if you're here today, you might be interested in the library's World Affairs discussion group, which meets weekly on Mondays at 4 p.m. We discuss various topics each week, and I'll share more information about that group in the chat. We love hearing from you about what you'd like to see happen at the library, so I'll also be sharing an online event feedback form in the chat, and you can fill that out and not only help the library, but also enter to win a library book bag. They come in 5 different colors. We are really thrilled today to partner with the Portsmouth Peace Treaty Forum on this event, and today's conversation is also co-sponsored by the Portsmouth Athenaeum and by River Run Bookstore. Another link that I will share in the chat is to purchase Joseph Nye's book via River Run Bookstore, and you can do that online for a discount. The discount is not available in store. So now I'm really pleased to turn it over to Chuck Doleac, who is chair of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty Forum. Chuck, take it away.
Welcome to the Portsmouth Peace Treaty Forum. The forum was founded in 1994 to commemorate the successful diplomacy of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty negotiations that ended the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. The forum invites diplomats and foreign policy academics to Portsmouth to explore diplomatic and foreign policy themes in the spirit of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. This year is the 115th anniversary of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty, and we are fortunate to have one of the world's leading scholars of international relations, Joseph S. Nye, Jr. His new book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, provides a concise and penetrating analysis of the modern era president's foreign policy decisions in the light of an ethical framework developed by Nye to evaluate the moral foreign policy decisions they made. This book provides new insight into ethical and foreign policy, moral decision making, and it's been extremely well received. Now, when I talked to Joe about coming here by Zoom, he agreed that he would do it, and we're thankful for him doing that. I also asked him how he wanted to be introduced, and he said, would you like me to call you Professor Nye? And he said, no, just call me Joe. And he also said he wanted me to make sure that I said he's coming to us from his 1822 his farmhouse in North Sandwich, New Hampshire. He is one of us, as the saying goes. But Joe, I've got to say something about your background, okay? For the group to understand a little bit about who you are. Joe is the University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at Harvard University, former Dean of the Kennedy School. He served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, Deputy Undersecretary of State, and other governmental positions over a number of administrations. He has many books to his credit. I will not try to talk about all of them, but we'll talk about 2 quickly. One is one that has just come into fore again, is the end of the American International Order. Joe is very, as a scholar, well-versed in that entire process, as we shall know. He also originated the concept of soft power, and we'll probably be talking about that in the discussion. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, he was named as the most influential scholar of American foreign policy, and in 2011, the Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the top 100 global thinkers. His book that he will be discussing today, and other things that people want to ask him about afterwards in terms of foreign policy, international relations, and the current world situation, will occur with the ability to give chat questions while we were having an initial discussion about the book. So now from the 1822 farmhouse in North Sandwich, New Hampshire, I'd like to introduce Joe Nye. And Joe, let me start this with a question. Why did this book came out in January of 2020. Why did you write the book?
Well, it's a great question. I would like to say that I anticipated that it was an election year in which President Trump would be the cause of the book, and it would all be about the moral issues and questions of what he has done in foreign policy. Actually, that had nothing to do with it. I've been interested in the whole question of what's a moral foreign policy for some time. And I used to teach a course at Harvard that was along these lines. I was intrigued also on how did Americans think about morality when we dealt with foreign policy issues. And in general, I think there's a tendency of people to say, well, morals don't have much to do with foreign policy because basically it's all about national interest. Or interest bakes the cake, and then politicians come along and sprinkle a little moral icing on it to make it look attractive, but it's all national interest. In fact, when I was working in the State Department years ago, I once turned to a French diplomat who was working across the table from me, and I said, "Do you ever worry or think about the moral implications of what we're discussing?" Which at that time happened to be nuclear weapons. And he said, "No," he said, "there are no moral issues. There's only the interests of France." And I don't think he realized what a profound moral judgment he had just made. So I was interested to say, if we look at the 14 presidents that the United States has had since World War II, if we took this view that it's only national interest, moral views don't make any difference, would we be accurate in terms of how we saw the history? And what I try to show in the book, in these 14 vignettes of the presidents, is in several cases you would have gotten history wrong. Because if you took the cynical view, basically you would have come out with a distorted view of what really happened in history. So those are the reasons behind the book, long before we got into 2020 and an election year.
Well, we'll get into the election year at the end of the talk. I think if we start with it, we'll just not get out of it. So in the book, you start with talking about the American moralism traditions in foreign policy. Think American exceptionalism, Wilson liberalism, and the Liberal International Order of 1945. Could you expand a little bit on those topics?
Well, American exceptionalism is really this belief that we Americans are different. After all, we came from Europe to worship God in a better way than the Europeans did. We thought of ourselves as more pure. That's why we were called Puritans in the early incarnations. And that tradition of thinking that we're special, that we're exceptional, that we're more moral, has stuck with us, even though we don't always behave that way. It's hard to regard Americans as exceptionally moral if we've taken away half of Mexico by force, and if we put down a revolution in the Philippines in the early 20th century, including waterboarding and torture. So the idea that we are always more moral than others is widely believed, but patently not true. So the American exceptionalism is a strong tradition, and it's led us very often, when we look at moral issues in foreign policy, to say if our intentions are good, then the action is moral. And what I've argued is, no, good intentions are not enough. Yes, Americans do try to be more moral, and that makes us moralistic, but it doesn't really mean that we always have good moral consequences. So I take exception with American exceptionalism.
What about Wilson liberalism?
Well, Wilson basically was very much a moralist, but he wanted to transform the international system. American exceptionalism really dealt with our view that we Americans were more moral. Wilson wanted to change international politics, and he thought that if you could create a League of Nations, if you could appeal to a charter of the League of Nations, we would, or covenant as he called it, is a good Presbyterian, we could change the way states dealt with each other in international politics. And that tradition has been a strong tradition. We see it today in the sort of successor to the League of Nations, which is the United Nations. And Henry Kissinger once said that we see Wilson's fingerprints all over our American foreign policy. But there was a reaction against Wilson and Wilsonianism, which is the feeling that he got us in over our heads by too much idealism. And that led to the isolationism of the 1930s. And that led to the third tradition that you mentioned, which is after 1945, there was a widespread feeling that Americans had gone too far in retreating from the world, that we had to do something to try to create institutions and a framework for world politics. And that led Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, I call the founders of the post-war era in my book, to create the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and so forth, and to create what's been known as the liberal international order, a framework of alliances and multilateral institutions, which was really the framework for American foreign policy until President Trump was elected in 2016, in which he began to question that. So those are three different traditions, and there's little bits of each of them that still exist.
And before we talk about actual foreign policy ethics, why don't we talk a little bit about what ethics are for an individual, how you make moral judgments for an individual?
Well, I argue that we really do have to think in three dimensions when we assess morality, whether it's for individuals or for foreign policy. And we judge whether a person has good intentions or good motives. We judge whether they've used good means, and we judge whether they have had good consequences. I illustrate this with a sort of a homely example of if a friend were to say, I'll pick up your daughter from the high school dance and make sure she gets home early because I know she has SAT exams tomorrow morning. He picks her up, doesn't notice that it's rained, the road is slick, and he drives 70 on a narrow country road trying to get her home early, skids off the road, hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. You wouldn't say, well, he had good intentions, therefore it was a moral act. You say he had good intentions, but he didn't choose appropriate means. He was speeding on a slippery road, and he didn't exercise due diligence about the means. He wasn't careful to make sure that he was using the right means. And he had essentially horribly immoral, unintended consequences. And in legal terms, when somebody doesn't pay enough attention to the prospect of immoral consequences, we call that culpable negligence. So I think those same three dimensions, motives, means, and consequences that we apply to individual actions can be applied to foreign policy. So, for example, when George W. Bush, when his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, said that you had to admire the morality of George W. Bush's foreign policy with his freedom agenda because of his moral clarity. My reaction to that was no. Excuse me, even if we grant him good intentions, he didn't pay adequate attention to the means that he had available. In fact, there were warnings from the intelligence community and the State Department that things were going to go wrong, and he tossed those aside. And the net effect was that he got rid of Saddam Hussein, but he strengthened al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then morphed into the Islamic State, ISIS, and that had horrible consequences for us and for the region. So that's a little bit like my car example, which is if you look at all three, motives, means, and consequences, it was a moral failure.
So Joe, when you look at foreign policy ethics, do they not have a double standards or dirty hand issues that are not in normal ethics?
Yes, definitely. And when you're dealing with foreign policy, a leader, a president, is a trustee for his or her people, his in the case of the United States. But as a trustee, you can't just do what you personally regard as morally right, because sometimes you have to do things that are in the interests of your people. So you might be, for example, a pacifist. You might oppose the use of troops. But if you're the president, you don't have that luxury to say, no, I won't use troops. You have to sometimes use troops to defend interests. A classic case of this is the case that's hypothetical about the leader who discovers that a terrorist has set a ticking time bomb in a city, and the question is, do you torture the terrorist to learn where the bomb is and defuse it? And if not, you might have 100,000 people killed. Would you, if you are a leader who believes profoundly that torture is immoral, would you, in fact, torture the terrorists to save 100,000 people who've elected you to be mayor of the city? And that's a tough one. That's where the dirty hands come in. That if it were just your personal choice, you might say, I won't do it. I'll have clean hands. But if you're talking about the lives of 100,000 people for whom you're responsible, you might, in fact, decide that it's better to have dirty hands. And those types of situations come up quite frequently in international affairs. Probably one of the most horrendous of these historically is the case of Winston Churchill in 1940, after Hitler broke through the Ardennes and captured France, and Britain was driven to the sea at Dunkirk. Churchill faced the prospect that the new French government, the Vichy government, would hand over the French fleet to Germany. And then Britain would be unable to defend itself. The Royal Navy couldn't defend the islands if the Germans had the French fleet. And so what did Churchill do? He bombed his ally. So the British, in an unprovoked attack, killed 1,300 French sailors who had just recently been their allies. And Churchill argued, I had to do this because I had to do it to protect my people. Those types of circumstances in international affairs are extremely rare, fortunately, but nonetheless, they can occur.
Okay. Joe, before we get into the presidents and you go through each one of them in an analysis that we will talk about in a minute, there are mental maps of the world and modern foreign policy. What are those, generally speaking?
Well, there are three major ways in which people can look at international relations. The most common or popular one is sometimes called realism. And it says, look, there are no international governments, international courts are weak, you can't enforce agreements. It's all a world of self-defense. And because you have to defend yourself, then you have to be very realistic and swallow hard against being moralistic or idealistic. And that's a simplified view of realism. Another one is cosmopolitanism, in which you say, look, we're all human beings. Borders and boundaries and nationalities are artificial. Look at the current pandemic. A virus doesn't care about the nationality of the human being it kills. We're all human, and therefore we should treat each person as equal and morally the same. And so we should deal in international relations with other peoples as though boundaries didn't exist. That's very idealistic, but in fact, boundaries do exist. And realists will, like Teddy Roosevelt, will object to idealists like Woodrow Wilson, who leaned in that direction. The third tradition is sometimes called international liberalism, which says that that states and boundaries exist, that there are rights and institutions, but they still are within a framework of national states, and therefore you think of a society of states, and which have international law, international institutions to help regulate their behavior. And this is to some extent what Wilson was trying to do, which was in creating the League of Nations, was create a broader framework for international politics. In practice, it turns out that most presidents are a combination of all three. There's a bit of realism, there's a bit of cosmopolitanism, and a bit of liberalism in almost all of them. And my personal way of expressing it, that you should always start with realism. If you're unrealistic in the world, you can make a real mess out of things. Very immoral consequences. That was my example of Bush in Iraq. I say start with realism, but don't stop there. Then go on and say, what other values do I want, such as human rights or international assistance to others and so forth. So each of these worldviews has a role to play, and different presidents combine them in different ways.
A scorecard for judging the presidents. And could you describe that scorecard and how you used it in the process you implemented?
Yeah, the scorecard is a way of just organizing these three dimensions of intentions, means, and consequences, and putting a little content under each one. So when you look at a president's intentions, you ask about what kind of a moral vision did he have? Did he express attractive values? And did he have the emotional intelligence to avoid contradicting those values because of his own personal needs? But you also, under intentions, look at prudence. Did the president have the contextual intelligence to balance the values pursued and the risks that he imposed on others? When you turn to the means that a president used, there are two dimensions there. One is, how did he use force? Did he use it with discrimination in treatment of civilians and proportionality of benefits and damages? This is a long tradition. It's sometimes called just war theory, that you try to protect innocent lives by distinguishing between military and civilian targets. But there's another dimension of means, which is the concerns of liberals, which is, did the president try to respect and use institutions at home and abroad? Did he pay respect to the rights of others? So those are intentions and means. On consequences, there are three dimensions. One is, was the president a good fiduciary or trustee? Were the long-term interests of the country advanced? Second is, did he pay attention to cosmopolitan issues? Did he consider the interests of other people and try to do as little damage to them as possible? And third is educational. Did the president respect the truth and build credibility? And were facts respected? Did he try to broaden moral discourse at home and abroad? So essentially, the scorecard takes the three dimensions of intentions, means, and consequences and gives you some checklists, if you want, along the dimensions I mentioned.
So, Joe, I don't know how to ask you to summarize how you looked at all presidents, but I think you divided them into time frames. And could you start with that and then talk about the presidents in a particular time frame and how you analyzed them?
Well, an easier way to do it may be to look at what the ones who did best on my scorecard and worst on my scorecard, with the rest sort of stretched out in between. The best were people from the earliest time frame, which was Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and from the middle time frame, George H.W. Bush, who I think had an extraordinary record of ending the Cold War without a shot being fired. Those come out in my top quartile, if you want, among the 14 presidents. The bottom quartile, the ones who did worst, are heavily affected by Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon come out in that quartile largely because of Vietnam. But they're also joined by the other President Bush, George W. Bush, because of Iraq. And then I rank the current president in that bottom quartile, though I admit that at this stage, his proper grade as a teacher, I would have to give an incomplete because he hasn't finished his term. But on what we've seen so far, I would say your listener will note the teachers put on the reports needs further improvement. The other presidents are stretched out in between with mixed grades, some higher and some lower, but the top and the bottom are relatively clear. I do try to say in the book that my own personal scoring is less important than that people make an effort as they judge morality and foreign policy to think in all three dimensions. And people can come up with their own scorecards, their own filling out of the scorecard, if you want. I'm not beholden to the way I filled out the scorecard, but I think it is important to go beyond simple statements like they had good intentions, therefore they were good.
Why do you say Harry Truman was so good?
Well, Harry Truman is fascinating. I mean, he gets a lot of moral criticism for dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But what's fascinating to me is the way Truman basically, how quickly he learned and how his moral views affected his use of atomic weapons or nuclear weapons. There was a third bomb which could have been dropped on Japan, and it was based on Tinian Island. And Truman told the military, no, they could not drop it. But even more important, that 5 years later in Korea, when he was losing the Korean War and it was going to destroy his political position, Truman was told by General Douglas MacArthur that if he gave MacArthur permission to drop 25 to 40 atomic bombs on Chinese cities, MacArthur could win the war for it. And Truman said, no, I'm not going to kill that many more innocent children. And that was quite an important moral decision that Truman made. Indeed, had he decided it otherwise, had he protected his political position along the lines that MacArthur wanted, the world today would look very, very different. as the Nobel economist Thomas Schelling once put it, one of the most important institutions that's developed since 1945 has been the nuclear taboo, that nuclear weapons are used just for deterrence and not for war fighting. And if Truman hadn't made those decisions, it would be a very different world today.
What do you think of Dwight Eisenhower?
I rate Eisenhower highly. Eisenhower was very careful to basically keep us out of war. He presided over some difficult times in the early days of the Cold War. Again, in 1954, when the North Vietnamese were about to take over the French position in Dien Bien Phu, and the military told Eisenhower that he could only save the situation if he used nuclear weapons, Eisenhower said no. Similarly, when the military suggested that he use nuclear weapons to protect the offshore islands between China, mainland China, and Taiwan, he again said no. Eisenhower is very cautious in terms of anything that could have gotten into a real war. He talked a lot about nuclear deterrence, but he was very cautious in the way he actually used force or nuclear force. That was the high part of Eisenhower. He sometimes engaged in covert interventions, for example, overthrowing governments in Iran and Guatemala, which were the low side. And that I'd put as a blemish on his scorecard, though he saw it as necessary to prevent the Soviets from winning in the Cold War. I think it wasn't that necessary, and but I still give him credit for his overall maintaining of peace and establishing the helping to consolidate the liberal international order, which ironically he had criticized when he was running for office in '52, but when he got into office, he consolidated it.
What about FDR?
I give FDR high ranks. He learned foreign policy on the job. When he first came into office in the Great Depression, he was very uninterested in foreign policy and didn't want, he turned down the British offer to have a economic conference in London that would have dealt with the Depression and monetary affairs. But FDR realized by 1938 that Hitler was going to be a threat. And he then began the process of preparing us for dealing with Hitler and the threat that he posed. He wasn't successful on that until the Japanese bombed the United States at Pearl Harbor. But once we were in the war, Roosevelt started thinking about how do you create a framework after the war for a better world. And that was the early stages of the planning for the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions for monetary and economic regulations. So I'd give him high marks there. But like every president, he had his flaws and blemishes. One, I think in particular, is I think he could have done more to save more Jews during World War II. He basically was worried about losing support of Southern conservatives in the Senate for his overall war gains. But there are a number of things like that where you can fault Roosevelt. But overall, I think his creating the framework for the post-Cold War world, post-World War II world, was extremely important.
And you think that the role of institutions is very important in terms of judging these presidents?
Well, institutions are important because they create a framework in which leaders can look to the future or can look beyond the immediate transactional interests they have. There's a very interesting study done by the University of Michigan political science named Robert Axelrod, in which he said, if people play a computer game, a simulated computer game in which you either cheat on a friend or a colleague or you cooperate with them, that the question of whether you cheat or not, and if you cheat, you save your own skin. If you cooperate, you pay some penalty. He said, whether you cheat or not depends on how often you're going to play with this person again in the future. And if you play this game time and again, you develop a practice of reciprocity. You know, I'm going to see you again. Let's both be a little bit more cooperative. And he called that the long shadow of the future. In other words, where there is a long shadow of the future, you can be more long run in your definition of your self-interest or your national interest. And that's what institutions do for you. They help create that long shadow of the future.
What about JFK?
Kennedy is a mixed, gets a mixed score on my scorecard, but it's also an incomplete because we don't know what would have happened if he had survived. He comes into office with the disaster of the Bay of Pigs, which was a mess, which he didn't handle very well. But then he handles the Cuban Missile Crisis, averting a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. He handles that extremely well. And he goes on to then start a process of arms control with the Soviet Union, the Limited Test Ban Treaty being the first step on that. He gets good marks for that as well. Then the question of Vietnam comes up. He mishandles the coup, which overthrows the Diem government. And the big question is, what would have happened if he had been reelected in 1964 instead of assassinated in 1963? Kennedy was always very careful to limit the role of the American troops in Vietnam. He had 16,000 troops there, but they were only to be advisors, not to be combatants. And the number of Americans killed during Kennedy's presidency in Vietnam was probably under 100. Contrast that with what Johnson did in 1965, after Johnson essentially won the 64 election. Johnson wound up putting something like 565,000 American troops into Vietnam, and we lost tens of thousands of American soldiers. And so there's a huge difference between Kennedy and Johnson on Vietnam. Many of Kennedy's defenders say that he would have basically gotten out if he'd been reelected rather than assassinated. Others say, oh no, that's just people who fall for the Kennedy myth. The answer is we can't know for sure. His scorecard would be, I think, a good one if we judged that he would have gotten out of Vietnam. His scorecard remains a mixed one when he increased our role in Vietnam, but didn't have the opportunity to get us out.
You judge LBJ and Nixon low in the scorecard, in the lowest quartile. Is LBJ's reason for that just Vietnam?
Primarily Vietnam, yes. It's ironic because in domestic policy, Johnson really was critical in terms of what he did for civil rights. I mean, he was, as somebody put it, he did more for civil rights than any president since Lincoln. So if you were judging his whole presidency, not just his foreign policy, and my scorecards in the book is about foreign policy, I certainly would rank Lyndon Johnson much higher. But on the question of what the damage was to us through Vietnam and the careless way in which Johnson, not careless, but the failure to think through the consequences that Johnson got us deeper and deeper into Vietnam. Those are unfortunately very bad marks on his scorecard.
And how honest was he with the American people?
Well, Lyndon Johnson was not honest. That was not his strong suit. When the Gulf, in the '64, there were two attacks by North Vietnamese patrol boats against American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, and the first one seems to be fairly clear. Second one, as Johnson himself put it, the damn sailors were probably shooting at flying fish. But Johnson told the Congress that they were both deliberate attacks on American vessels, and got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution from the Congress, which gave him a blank check to expand the war in Vietnam. Not a notable act of honesty.
I always thought Nixon was considered high in foreign policy because he opened China.
Well, Nixon gets good grades for the opening of China. That was indeed a success. But people sometimes don't realize that Nixon was not very good on international economics. He basically, because of the approach of the '72 election, he didn't take the steps he needed to curb inflation, and so he basically didn't do the things needed for a responsible international economic policy. So he was very good on balance of power politics, bringing China into a de facto alliance against the Soviet Union, not good on international economics. So the tipping point on the balance of his actions on foreign policy was really his actions in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, Nixon tried to get what he called a decent interval. And a decent interval meant that there would be a time between when the Americans pulled out and when the North Vietnamese took over. As it turned out, that decent interval was about 2 years. And the question is, should he have sacrificed 22,000 American troops to buy basically 2 years? Or could he have taken the advice of somebody like Senators Mansfield or others who said, just cut your losses and get out, save these lives? I think Nixon's actions in Vietnam of trying to sacrifice lives to get what he called a decent interval was not a moral action.
What about Carter?
Well, Carter is given credit for raising the profile of human rights in American foreign policy, and he indeed did that. Sometimes people say, oh, this was just idealism and he failed in everything else. He failed as a realist. I don't think that's true. Carter did bring about the Camp David Accords. He did have a non-proliferation policy to slow the spread of nuclear weapons. He did basically bite the bullet and give back the Panama Canal to Panama, which was not popular, but was a way of forestalling what might have otherwise been a anti-American guerrilla warfare in much of Latin America. So I think Carter actually had a better foreign policy record than people give him credit for. And they sometimes look at his human rights policy and say, oh, well, that means that he was just an idealist. He was more than that.
But what did he do for soft power?
Well, when you have soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. When you have a foreign policy which is seen as moral or legitimate in the eyes of others, that makes your country more attractive. So Carter's human rights policy did indeed enhance American soft power.
It did. What about Ronald Reagan?
Ronald Reagan, I think, came out on my scorecard much higher than I originally felt at the time. Reagan talked, I mean, his rhetoric was very impressive about moral clarity, but people don't realize that he combined that with an ability to negotiate. And so when Gorbachev came to power, Reagan very quickly found ways to negotiate with him when many of people in his administration were opposed to it, such as Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. And Reagan's basically, he fell back upon the part of his background where he'd been head of the Screen Actors Union in Hollywood, negotiating labor contracts all the time. And so the man who was known for his rhetoric as an ideologue, in fact, was a very practical bargainer and negotiator. In fact, when people once said to Reagan in '88, when he was in Moscow on an arms control summit, just a year ago, you were in Berlin saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. How do you justify your being here in Moscow negotiating now?" And Reagan's comment was, "That was then and this is now."
What about George H.W. Bush?
Well, George H.W. Bush, it comes out very well on my scorecard. I mean, he was a very prudent, very cautious, but that was just what we needed at a time when the Soviet Union was collapsing, and when you could have imagined crises which could have led to shooting war, including escalation to nuclear war. Bush, in fact, negotiated with Gorbachev and made sure that you didn't let this deteriorate. And he did it in a way where Germany was reunited and remained within NATO and without a shot being fired. That was an extraordinary foreign policy accomplishment. And Bush did this in part by patience and by not letting his politics or his ego get in the way. At one point, people, when the Berlin Wall came down in November '89, people complained to Bush that he wasn't making a big enough deal of it. We should be celebrating, we should be cheering and so forth. And Bush said, "I'm not going to dance on the wall. I have to negotiate with Gorbachev."
What about Clinton?
Clinton, I think, again, a mixed bag. He was quite uncertain on foreign policy when he first comes into office. He doesn't come to terms with the problems in Bosnia until basically '95. He allows the genocide in Rwanda to spread in ways he couldn't have saved everybody, but he could have saved some. He has trouble figuring out what to do with Haiti. His first couple of years in foreign policy is marked by uncertainty. He gets his feet on the ground a little bit better as he learns on the job. And he also tried to create a framework. He tried to basically establish a situation where greater economic interdependence would create a framework for a post-Cold War world. He tried to negotiate this with Yeltsin. Unfortunately, Yeltsin wasn't quite up to it in terms of his health. So Clinton gets a mixed bag, but overall, I think I'd give him pretty good marks. Part of what he did was reaffirm the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which is something I was involved in when I was in the government. And that was very important, essentially, for creating a framework for dealing with the rise of China. And at that time, in 93, 94, it wasn't obvious that the US-Japan alliance was going to survive the end of the Cold War. But in fact, it did, and that's a profound importance to America's position in Asia.
Yes. It seems that Clinton, you give Clinton lower marks because of the way he handled interventionism.
Well, there was an uncertainty on his interventionism. I mean, in the early stages, the way they handled Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, so forth was pretty inept. And the failure to do anything about Rwanda, those were I think inadequately handled interventions.
How would you describe what a president should go through when he decides he's going to intervene?
Well, I think intervention, there are many ways of intervening besides militarily. You can have declaratory policy, you can have sanctions against a country, you can have sanctions against particular individuals in the country. There are a variety of ways to intervene besides sending in the 82nd Airborne. But if you are going to use military force, then you have to think through how likely is it to be successful, and how am I going to get them out, not just how do I get them in, and what are the unintended consequences likely to be if I haven't thought those things through. And I think those are the difficulties with military intervention. Very often your initial intentions and hopes are thwarted or disappointed when you get into the on the ground complexity of the situation.
Is that why you gave the rank you did to George Walker Bush?
Yes, I think George W. did not fully think these things through. I think he was overly optimistic. There were a number of people in his administration who explicitly said going into Iraq is going to be a cakewalk. We're going to be greeted as victors. This is not a big problem. Alas, that was not true. There were people who warned him that it wasn't true, but he didn't pay much attention to the warnings.
What about Obama?
Obama it's still hard to give a real judgment. You need a decade or so to see how things shake out. But at this stage, we're dealing with just 3.5 years since Obama. Again, I gave him a mixed score. I think he did some things well and other things not so well. I mean, I think there was a problem that he faced in terms of how he dealt with the Middle East, which was going to be hard anyway. I mean, but the way he handled the so-called Arab Spring, initially he was a bit too optimistic. And then when he saw this deteriorate in Syria, he decided he wanted nothing to do with it and became a humanitarian disaster. So there was I would say the Middle East and the Arab world was a problem for him. On the other hand, Obama did negotiate the Paris climate, negotiate with the Chinese to make sure that you could get the framework for the Paris Climate Accords, which was an important step. And I think Obama did take a number of other steps, trying to control some of the aspects of nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. So I think some things he did well, some things not as well.
Last but not least, Donald J. Trump.
Well, President Trump, again, in terms of time to judge, it's much too soon because he's still in office and we don't know the full effects of what he's done. I think the things that people generally, and my scorecard gives him credit for, is he has been relatively prudent in the use of force. I mean, he talks a lot about it, but he hasn't gotten us into risky uses of force. And I think he deserves credit for that. On other areas, I think he gets credit for being tough on some of the abuses that China had been involved in the trade area. I think he didn't handle it very well. He should have done it with our allies rather than in spite of our allies. I mean, he put tariffs on our friends at the same time, put tariffs on China, which I think was a mistake. But nonetheless, in terms of telling China that they couldn't go on with the type of economic behavior they were engaging in, I give him credit for that as well. I think where he fails, or where at this stage, so far as we can tell, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, I think was a big mistake. In the midst of a pandemic, pulling out of the World Health Organization and leaving it to China is a big mistake. It's telling people that you think you'll withdraw from NATO, even though he didn't do it yet, and weakening the NATO alliance is a gift to Putin and to Russia. And I think, so in that sense, I think there are more problems in terms of on the negative side of the ledger than the positive side of the ledger. Unless that sounds like a partisan statement in an election year, I would just urge people to read the book by John Bolton, who's a very conservative Republican, who basically says that Trump had no strategy in his foreign policy and everything was determined by his own political needs and ego. That's from a conservative Republican, not from a liberal Democrat.
At the end of your book, you talk about foreign policy challenges back in January of 2020. I'll give you a couple of them. China. What would you say about that now?
Well, I think the big question for us is, as we look at this century, is to make sure that we don't have a breakdown in the relations with China, similar to what happened in the 20th century, when the rising Germany created a fear in establishment Britain, which led to World War I, which was a disaster for those countries, but for Europe as a whole and for the world as a whole. So if we fail to manage the China relationship and it breaks out into a war, I think that will be an enormous moral failure. At the same time, there are many things that China is doing which we don't approve of and shouldn't approve of, and where we're going to have to push back on China. But pushing back is not a strategy. And we have to think through, how do you accomplish a situation where you can push back on China, for example, their behavior in the South China Sea of asserting sovereignty or territorial seas around artificial islands, which is against international law, and at the same time cooperate with China simultaneously on issues like climate or pandemics. And that ability to have what I call a cooperative rivalry, where you're cooperating and competing simultaneously, is going to be one of the hard moral challenges for any president in this century.
What do you think of Teddy Roosevelt?
Well, Teddy Roosevelt was fascinating. I mean, he's the reason we're having this conversation. We're celebrating his accomplishments at Portsmouth in 1905, and that won him a Nobel Prize. So that part of Teddy Roosevelt gets high marks. On the other hand, Teddy Roosevelt also had some failures, or not failures, but moral failures. For example, his condoning torture in the Philippines and promoting his friends from the Cuban-American War, who were the generals who were responsible for it, and disciplining the chief of staff of the army who tried to discipline the generals who were condoning torture. That's immoral. And while you can admire Roosevelt, I think he's one of the great American presidents for a lot of things, a lot of reasons. You've got to realize that he also had his flaws.
We've been getting a number of questions from the audience. They're a little bit philosophical, if I might say. Under what circumstances are offensive wars moral?
Offensive wars.
Offensive.
I find it hard to, I mean, the problem is, what do you mean by offensive? If you say, I'm going to conquer a territory, or I'm going to invade a country and change its government, I find it hard to see those as moral. On the other hand, there may be situations where humanitarian interventions, where you are going into a situation uninvited, but to save a people who are being massacred by their own dictator, that might be morally justifiable. But then you have to make sure that you have a good idea of how it's going to turn out in terms of consequences. So, for example, Obama intervened by bombing in Libya when Gaddafi was threatening to massacre citizens of Benghazi, and he did get a UN resolution to justify it, but they didn't follow through. There was no plan for what you did with Libya after Gaddafi was gone, and Libya is a mess today. So again, if that's an offensive war, which is that we used force in Libya without invitation from the government, that humanitarian intervention failed because we hadn't thought through what if, if you get rid of Gaddafi, then what?
Consequences, so to speak.
Consequences, that's right. All my three dimensions.
Got to be laid out.
Also means and consequences.
You've been in the government, and you've been as an academic, and and you consider foreign policy issues as an academic and in government. How does that change, if at all?
When you're in government, you don't have the luxury of time to think about things. Events come at you very fast and from many directions, and sometimes people say it's like drinking from a fire hose. It's like sit down and think this through, but you often don't have that luxury to think it through carefully. And so you have to do the best you can with the limited time that you have. When you're an academic, you have the time to basically say, well, I don't think I've thought this through enough. I'm going to tear up that draft of my analysis and do some more research and sort of rewrite it and think it through again. And it may mean that the book that you're planning to publish or the article comes out a year or 2 years or 10 years later. But at least when you get it out, you think, I think I've got that right. In government, you can't do that. You don't have the 2 years or 10 years.
Well, your book's been very well received, Joe, as you know. I have some other philosophical questions. How do you assess the role of cabinet staff in presidential morality?
Well, cabinet play a crucial role. I mean, they make a big difference. Different presidents pay different attention to different cabinet members, but if you go back to Harry Truman, and you notice that he surrounded himself with strong cabinet members and listened to them. And he also was willing to let them take the credit. I mean, so the Marshall Plan was named after Secretary of State George Marshall. It could have been the Truman Plan. Truman said, we're going to have a better chance of selling it on Capitol Hill to the Congress, well, the Marshall Plan than the Truman Plan. And but it's clear that Truman knew exactly what was happening and did so. Dean Acheson, who succeeded Marshall as Secretary of State, makes clear in his memoirs, President, the Creation, that even though Truman surrounded himself with strong, smart people, Truman was in control. In other words, it was not a situation where he was the puppet of these people. So having strong and able cabinet members is a mark of a good president. And then figuring out how to make them work as a team and how to preserve your own decision space is crucial. This is again where George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, was very successful. He had a team which included James Baker as a very successful Secretary of State, and Dick Cheney, who at that time was Secretary of Defense, who was less successful as a vice president for George W. Bush later, but at that time was an important member, an effective member of the team. And Brett Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, was able to organize a process where Bush was getting advice from many different sources. And so he preserved his own ability to make decisions, but he surrounded himself with smart people with strong views to make sure that he got different views of different cabinet members. So it's not just getting good cabinet members, it's being able to use them effectively that's important.
Okay. Joe, this is a more philosophical question. People like your scorecard. You've explained it very well, apparently. And they want to know how your scorecard relates to the efficacy of NATO.
Well, I think NATO has been a success in the sense that it's a framework which has lasted longer than most alliances last. Traditionally, in international politics, alliances last as long as they're useful or convenient. NATO involves a great deal of sharing. Indeed, I was responsible when I worked in the Pentagon. I was responsible for NATO affairs from my office, International Security Affairs. And going to NATO meetings, you realize NATO is a lot of committees. I mean, it's got all sorts of people going through, but you have all these countries have a chance to say, they each meet, they interact with each other. That feeling of broader participation in the alliance is a mark of its success, and one of the reasons why it has succeeded, despite the extraordinary changes in world politics from the 1949 when it was formed at the height of the Cold War, through the end of the Cold War, through the world we're living in today. So I'd say NATO is an example of a successful institution. And within the framework of that institution, we've been able to moderate a lot of conflicts and deter others.
What do you think about the diminishment of human rights in U.S. diplomacy now?
Well, I think it's a mistake. I think you can't have just a human rights policy, because then you'd have no foreign policy. Foreign policy is a process in which you're trading off different values. And so if you just pursue human rights, you would not pursue some aspects of security or some aspects of welfare and trade and so forth. But on the other hand, human rights do express who we are as a people. This is where there's something to be said for American exceptionalism. And in that sense, I think a good example, which I mentioned in the book, is the way President Trump responded to the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And what President Trump said was, "Oh, get over it. It doesn't matter all that much. We have other interests such as arms sales and stability in the Gulf and so forth." But even the Wall Street Journal, conservative editorial page, wrote an editorial saying that Trump made a mistake in not saying more about American values, that we don't accept or tolerate that sort of behavior. So there are always trade-offs in relation to human rights, but being totally silent on them or ignoring them is, I think, a big mistake.
How does your scorecard figure in judging how we deal with the ascendancy of strong men in other countries like Philippines, etc.?
Well, there are some cases where there's not much we can do about them. I mean, we don't like Putin. We don't like Xi Jinping. We can't do much about them, or Erdogan in Turkey. But we can still voice objections. We can say that we disapprove of what Xi has done with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. We disapprove of Putin's behavior in poisoning his opponent Navalny. So there are things you can say. You're not going to bomb the country because of it, but you can at least express in declaratory policy the values that we want to uphold.
Is torture as a foreign policy ever justified?
Well, that's an interesting question. It goes back to my ticking time bomb in the city example. I find it hard to justify. I think in the aftermath of 9/11, we allowed torture. It was called enhanced interrogation. And I think most people who looked at that carefully feel in retrospect that was a mistake, that it really didn't save lives and it did diminish our values. On the other hand, could I imagine a situation where justified? I guess I could imagine it, but I think we ought to have a general prohibition against it because the chances of falling down that slippery slope are too great.
What do you think about the legislative power in foreign policy, its diminishment over time?
Well, the Congress still plays a very important role in foreign policy. There was a famous constitutional scholar named Edwin Corwin who wrote a book about the legislature and the Congress in foreign policy, and the title to his book tells it all. When asked, what does the Constitution say? He says, it's an invitation to struggle. In other words, given to both the president and the Congress, and they have to learn how to bargain and how to struggle. And over the years, the pendulum has swung back and forth between the Congress and the presidency. There was a period when Arthur Schlesinger wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency, saying that Congress that the president had become too strong during the Cold War. After the Vietnam era, Congress reasserted itself and passed a number of laws to set limits on what the executive can be. Subsequently, there were a number of people who said, oh, the Congress went too far and we need to restore executive privilege. Right now, this is a struggle that's still going on, as we've been seeing in the tug of war between President Trump and the Congress.
You familiar with the former Vice President Biden and his workings in government? What as Vice President?
My impression from watching Vice President Biden was that he was very successful, and he surrounded himself with very good people like Jake Sullivan, who's a close advisor to him on foreign policy, or Anthony Blinken, who's another close advisor. So Biden had a reputation for having an independent mind, for being thoughtful and surrounding himself with good people when he was vice president.
Well, Joe, thank you very much. We've kept you here for an hour and 15 minutes. It was supposed to be an hour. I apologize for that.
Always nice to visit Portsmouth, even if it's only virtual.
Okay, thank you. We'll get you here in person.
Okay, I will.
I have to ask one question. How are the bears and the chickens now?
Well, alas, we've decided to go out of the chicken business because the bear has broke down the door to our chicken house twice. So even with full repairs, we realized that when you're battling bears, it's a losing battle.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.